Have you ever wondered what a person becomes after they've begged for mercy and were answered with silence? My name is Nora Lane. I'm 34 years old. I live in Seattle. And on the surface, you'd probably say my life looks polished. I run a boutique, interior design firm that's been featured in magazines. I have a daughter, a small home with climbing ivy, and a calendar filled with client meetings. But 3 years ago, I was sitting alone in a hospital hallway, holding my 8-year-old daughter's medical file, realizing that no one in my family was coming to help. I grew up believing that family was an anchor, something you could count on when the tides rose. What I didn't understand then was that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who will watch you drown to protect their shoes from getting wet. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about appearance versus reality, loyalty tested by inconvenience, and what happens when a woman who's been invisible all her life stops asking to be seen and starts becoming undeniable. Before you judge the choices I made, walk with me through the days that broke me. Then ask yourself, what would you have done differently? I was raised in a family that didn't just care about how things looked, they built their identity on it. My parents, Evelyn and Charles Lane, weren't celebrities or CEOs, but you wouldn't know that from the way they presented themselves. My father owned a string of upscale furniture showrooms in Portland, and my mother was known for hosting charity galas she barely believed in. Our house looked like a photo shoot for a lifestyle magazine. Fresh flowers, polished marble, quiet tension. Everything was curated: outfits, dinners, even conversations. To the outside world, we were close, successful and admirable. But behind closed doors, the warmth was carefully rationed, and I received very little of it. I have a younger brother named Lucas, 2 years my junior, endlessly charming, and, most importantly, easier for my parents to love. I wasn't rebellious or difficult. I got straight A's, stayed out of trouble, and spent most of my time in the corner of the room with a book in my hands. But I didn't sparkle. I didn't know how to perform affection the way Lucas did, and in our house, affection had to be earned with performance. It didn't matter how well I did. When I received a state writing award in high school, my mother said, "Of course you did. You were always the bookish one." But when Lucas scored a goal in a local soccer match, she sent cupcakes to his whole team and posted photos online with the caption, "So proud of our little star." I learned early that in our family, love wasn't offered, it was negotiated, and the currency was charm. I remember once overhearing my parents talking at a dinner party. My father was bragging about Lucas's natural leadership as he poured wine for a guest. I had just gotten accepted into a competitive summer program for architecture, but I wasn't mentioned. Not once. I stood in the hallway, just outside the dining room, my acceptance letter in my hand, and realized something painful. I was never going to be part of the story they told about themselves. After high school, I moved away. I chose a university in Chicago, not just for the architecture program, but because it was far. I thought distance would dull the ache, but it only made their silence louder. When Lucas decided to stay in Portland and study business locally, my parents remodeled the basement into a creative space for him and bought him a used BMW as a surprise. When I graduated with honors, they mailed a card. No plane ticket, no visit, just a card with a pre-written quote about determination and a scribbled, "Congrats, Mom and Dad." Still, I didn't resent Lucas. He never asked to be the golden child. He was friendly, well-liked, and knew how to make people feel at ease. But the truth is, he didn't have to try very hard to be seen. I did. And no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough to change the story they had already decided on. Eventually, I stopped trying. I poured my energy into building something on my own, something that didn't depend on anyone else's permission to exist. I worked part-time while studying, slept in a cramped apartment, and slowly began to sketch out a life that looked nothing like theirs. I didn't have my parents' money or Lucas's natural ease, but I had drive. And I had silence. The kind that comes when no one is watching and no one expects anything. It hurt. But it also gave me space to build without fear of disappointing someone's image. Still, no matter how far I went or how successful I became, there was always a part of me that hoped they would notice, that they would one day look up from their wine glasses and say, "We're proud of you, Nora." But pride, in my family, was a commodity, and I didn't know the price. Every major moment in my life was met with indifference. When I opened my first office, a 300-square-foot space next to a bakery, I emailed them a photo. My father replied 2 days later, "Looks cozy. Hope the rent is manageable." No mention of effort, no congratulations. Just a reminder to stay. Practical. I learned to celebrate alone, quietly. Sometimes with Matt, my partner at the time, who tried to understand, though he never fully could. He grew up with the kind of parents who saved every birthday card he made as a kid. I grew up with the kind who critiqued my posture during dinner. There was no single moment where I realized my family wasn't safe to lean on. It was a slow erosion, a 1,000 missed chances to connect, 1,000 moments of choosing image over intimacy. But I still held out hope. Hope that maybe one day, if the stakes were high enough, they'd remember that I existed. Not just as a name they put on Christmas cards, but as someone who once needed them. I just didn't know that the moment they would be needed most would be the moment they chose their reputation over my child's life. By the time I turned 28, I had designed over 40 residential and small commercial spaces across Chicago and Seattle. My studio, Nora Lane Interiors, started with a hand-me-down laptop and a Craigslist drafting table. I didn't have investors, and I certainly didn't have parental backing. What I had was an instinct for how space could shape emotion, how the right light or the right texture could turn an ordinary corner into a memory. I built slowly, quietly, and thoroughly. Word spread from client to client. I wasn't famous, but I was trusted, and that was enough for me. It was during a site visit to an old bakery-turned-coffee house in Capitol Hill that I met Daniel. He was the systems engineer redesigning the building's energy flow. We bonded over bad coffee and a shared hatred for fluorescent lighting. Daniel was different from the people I grew up with. Grounded, thoughtful, without any desire to impress. He listened, not to respond, but to understand. That first conversation turned into lunch, then walks in the park, then one rainy evening, a promise that we would build something better. Together. A year later, we were married in a small, borrowed garden space. No chandeliers, no floral arches. Just us, a few close friends, and a playlist of songs we both loved. I didn't invite my parents, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I didn't want to give them a stage to pretend. Lucas sent a message saying, "Wish I could be there," and posted a picture later that same day of himself on a boat with his fiancée, holding champagne. That was his version of support. And then came Lena, our daughter. Bright-eyed, curious, born with a strange little laugh that sounded like a hiccup and a bird call at once. From the moment she came into the world, everything changed. The deadlines didn't matter as much. The critiques, the old wounds, they dimmed a little. I wasn't just building rooms for strangers anymore. I was building a world for her, the I. First few years weren't easy. Daniel's engineering contracts were irregular, and my firm was still small. We cut corners where we could. We skipped vacations. We bought secondhand. But we were happy. Genuinely happy. Lena had everything she needed: books, blankets, bedtime stories. The only thing we hadn't invested in yet was full health insurance. The monthly premiums were too high, and we were barely making it from one project to the next. So we told ourselves we'd wait. Just a little longer. After the next deal. After the next contract. We were healthy. Lena was healthy. What could go wrong? We lived in a modest townhouse near Beacon Hill. There was a garden just large enough for Lena to chase butterflies in, and a tiny sunroom where I would sketch while she colored next to me. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. Every corner of it held fingerprints of our effort. I remember thinking more than once that we'd finally figured it out, that maybe the hard part was over. I still hadn't fully let go of the hope that one day my parents would reach out, not with criticism, but with sincerity. When Lena was born, I sent them a photo. No response. When I designed the lobby of a new tech startup and my work got mentioned in a local publication, I forwarded them the article. My mother replied, "Nice. I think Lucas is speaking at a conference next month. Remind me to send you the link." It was always like that. Their world remained full of Lucas. Mine they never visited, not physically, not emotionally, not even out of polite obligation. And yet, when the ground finally gave way beneath us, when Lena's body began to tremble, from something we couldn't name, when our carefully stacked life began to collapse, I still thought of them, as if some primitive part of me still believed, if they knew, really knew, they would care. I was wrong, but at the time, I didn't know that. I still believed that family, despite everything, would show up when it mattered most. It started with a cough, light, dry, harmless. Lena had just turned 8. She was still chasing moths in the garden, still making up bedtime songs about magical libraries and invisible wolves. We thought it was a seasonal allergy, or maybe a cold she picked up at school. But then it lingered. It worsened at night. She'd wake up gasping, one small hand pressed to her chest, the other searching blindly for mine in the dark. We took her to a neighborhood clinic. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes and a too bright smile, listened to Lena's chest and told us it was likely bronchitis. She gave us syrup and said to monitor her breathing. We went home relieved to have an answer, relieved it wasn't worse. But deep down, something in me stayed unsettled. Call it instinct, call it fear, but mothers know when something doesn't sit right in the body of their child. 2 weeks later, Lena was drawing at the coffee table when she stopped suddenly, her crayon slipping from her hand. She looked up at me, confused. "Mom," she whispered, "my heart feels like it's racing too fast." Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. I dropped everything, scooped her into my arms, and called Daniel, who was already in the car before I finished the sentence. At the emergency room, everything moved in slow motion and at full speed all at once. Questions, wires, scans, worried glances between nurses. The smell of antiseptic seared itself into my memory, mingling with the metallic taste of panic in my throat. After hours of waiting under flickering lights, a doctor finally came in holding a thick folder and an expression I'll never forget. Gentle but heavy. "We found a mass," he said. "In her left lung. It appears to be benign, but it's pressing against her airway. We need to operate. Soon." "How soon?" I asked. "Within 3 days," he replied. "Otherwise, it could compromise her breathing permanently." Then came the number. $94,000. That was the estimated total cost, with post-operative care. No insurance. No time to apply for emergency coverage. I didn't even hear the rest. I felt the floor vanish. Daniel and I had maybe $20,000 in savings. We'd just completed a project and were planning to use that money to pay off debts. The idea of pulling together nearly $100,000 in 3 days? It wasn't impossible. It was unimaginable. We tried everything that first night. The hospital offered a payment plan, but we didn't qualify. Our credit score wasn't high enough. Daniel called his old employer to see if they had any bridge loans. I posted on social media, swallowing my pride and typing out the most painful sentence I had ever written. "Our daughter needs emergency surgery. We need help." I didn't sleep. I watched Lena's tiny chest rise and fall in the hospital bed, her body hooked up to machines, her hand clutching the little stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 3. She looked so small, too small to carry something this heavy. I pressed my lips to her forehead and promised her silently that I would not let this be the end of her story. That night, as the city slept beyond the windows, Daniel and I sat in the hallway and stared at our options. None of them were enough. None of them would save her in time. And that was when I said it. "I'll call them." Daniel looked up. "Are you sure?" "No," I said. "But they're her grandparents. It's strange what desperation can make. You forget. All the years of silence, of being overlooked, of being the daughter who never quite fit the frame, they all collapsed under the weight of one truth. Lena might die, and we had nowhere else to turn." I picked up my phone. My fingers hesitated. Then I dialed the number I hadn't used in almost 2 years. It rang once. Twice. And then my mother's voice, cool and practiced, filled the line. "Nora," my mother answered, her tone light, controlled, as if she were expecting a call about a misplaced dinner reservation, not a life-or-death plea. I froze for a second. The sound of her voice brought back memories I didn't want, of rooms that smelled like perfume and cold approval, of being praised only when guests were around, of being invisible once they left. But I pushed it aside. This wasn't about me. "It's Lena," I said, voice shaking despite my effort to stay composed. "She's in the hospital. There's a mass in her lung. She needs surgery. Soon. We don't have the money." There was a long pause on the other end. Not the kind that comes from shock or worry, just calculation. "How much?" she asked finally. 94,000. "We have some, but we're short." I didn't know where else to turn. She sighed. A soft, exasperated thing, like I'd asked her to reschedule a massage. "Nora, you know we're planning Lucas's engagement weekend. The rehearsal dinner is at the Waterfront Club. Everything's already paid for." I clenched the phone so tightly my fingers ached. "I'm not asking you to cancel anything. I'm just asking for help, even a portion." Another pause. Then, as if offering a compromise, she added, "Maybe we can revisit this after the wedding. I'll talk to your father. But right now, this isn't the best time. Not the best time." I think part of me knew, right then, that the conversation was over before it had begun. Still, I held on, maybe to my last thread of hope. "She's your granddaughter," I said quietly. "She's just a little girl. She hasn't done anything wrong." Her voice turned sharper, colder. "Don't guilt me, Nora. You've made your choices. You wanted independence, remember? You walked away from this family." I stood there in the hospital hallway, surrounded by beeping monitors and sterile white walls, and felt something break. I wanted to scream, but I only whispered, "I didn't walk away. I just got tired of knocking on a locked door." Before she could respond, I hung up. Daniel looked at me from across the room. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. I nodded once and sat down on the edge of the chair beside Lena's bed. She was still asleep, unaware that her life now depended on strangers, because the people who shared her blood had chosen a rehearsal dinner over her breath. I didn't cry, not yet. My body was too stunned, too cold. An hour later, my father sent a text. One sentence. "We can't compromise the family's image for personal issues. I hope you understand." I stared at it for a long time. I read it 3 times, each one cutting deeper. Personal issues. My daughter's life had become a personal inconvenience. The next morning, I tried once more. Not because I believed things would change, but because I needed to know, without question, that I had done everything. I drove to their estate in the suburbs. I hadn't been there in years. The gate had been upgraded, now equipped with an intercom and camera. When I pressed the call button, my mother's voice came through, amused. "Nora, what are you doing here?" "Please," I said. "Just 5 minutes. I brought the medical records. Just read them. Please." A long silence. Then the gate buzzed open. Their house looked like it always had. Immaculate, soulless, too large for warmth. Inside, the scent of candles masked the absence of care. I found my parents in the garden patio, sipping coffee and talking about flower arrangements for the engagement party. I placed the file on the table between them. My hands were shaking. "Read it," I said. My father didn't touch it. "This is not how you approach us, Nora. Not during a family celebration." I turned to my mother. "Lena could die. This isn't drama. This is real. I'm not asking for your love. I'm asking for a loan. Please." My mother stood, smoothed the fabric of her blouse. "You chose your path. You left. You said you didn't need us. And now you come back during Lucas's engagement weekend?" I looked at them. These people who had watched me grow up and never really seen me. Who smiled for photos and never stayed for hard conversations. Who dressed in luxury but had no room in their hearts. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't their daughter anymore. Maybe I never had been. I gathered the folder, nodded, and walked away. Not just from the table, not just from the house, but from everything they'd ever made me believe I owed them. Whatever came next, I would face it without them. Because blood had proven it meant nothing. 2 days after that final plea, Lena's condition began to worsen. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cooler than it should have been, and her voice, once a melody in every room, was barely a whisper. The doctors extended their window for the operation by a day, but even that was cutting it close. Daniel and I were running on fumes. We'd sold our car, cleared our savings, even posted on every crowdfunding site we could find. But time was against us. So was the math. We were still $42,000 short. That same morning, Lucas's engagement. Rehearsal was the top story in a regional lifestyle blog. There was a headline: "The Lanes host an evening of elegance, waterfront glamour, and legacy." The article gushed about the imported champagne, the custom ice sculptures, the venue overlooking the bay. There were photos of my parents holding glasses of wine, beaming. Lucas stood beside his fiancée, Olivia, the daughter of a real estate developer with her own line of organic skincare. In one picture, they were laughing beneath a flower arch that probably cost more than Lena's entire medical bill. I should have looked away, closed the browser, protected my heart. But I didn't. Instead, I put on a coat, printed out the invoices and Lena's updated scans, and told Daniel I was going back. Not to beg, to be seen. Just once. Just to look them in the eyes and give them the choice with everything laid bare. Arrived at the waterfront venue just as golden hour painted everything in a soft, forgiving glow. The valet looked surprised when I stepped out of a rideshare car holding a manila folder instead of a clutch. The music was soft jazz, the kind meant to be heard but not listened to. I walked through crowds of people I'd once watched from afar. Investment. Bankers, real estate power couples, women with impossible skin. No one recognized me. Or maybe they did and chose not to. I found my mother near the terrace, laughing over oysters. She froze when she saw me. "Nora," she said under her breath, stepping away from her friends. "You can't just show up like this." I handed her the folder. "Read it, please. Just look at it." She didn't take it. "You're making a scene." A few heads turned. Conversations paused. I could hear the breeze off the water and the tightness of my own breath. My father approached, flanked by Lucas and 2 men in matching linen jackets. "What's going on?" he asked sharply. "She's here about the child," my mother muttered. "The child?" Lucas laughed, shaking his head. "You mean your daughter?" I turned to him. "She needs surgery. It's urgent. We've exhausted every option. We're just short of what we need. I'm not here to guilt you. I'm just asking for humanity. Lucas smirked. So you want us to cancel the event? Refund everything? Lose the deposit on the yacht? I stared at him, unable to believe how detached he sounded. No, I said. I want you to care more about a little girl's life than a cake made to look like the Seattle skyline. My father stepped forward. You're embarrassing yourself, and us. This isn't the time or place. Then when? I asked. When she stops breathing? When the machines do what your money wouldn't? There was silence. Awkward, suffocating silence. Someone near the bar was filming. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Maybe that's what made my mother finally take the folder. She opened it, glanced at the top page, and closed it again. We can't help, she said. It's gone. The money's spent. The venue. The dress. The PR team. The photographers. There's nothing left. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I turned to leave. Nora, my father called after me. This doesn't reflect well on you. I stopped mid-step, slowly turned back. Neither does letting your granddaughter die because the catering bill came first. That was the last thing I ever said to them face to face. When I returned to the hospital, Lena was sleeping. Daniel looked at me, not with questions, but with quiet resolve. He put a blanket over my shoulders and said, "We're not done. We're not giving up." And we didn't. But something in me had shifted. Not just sadness, not even rage. Something colder. A clarity. I had grown up believing that love required effort. That maybe, if I could just be good enough, kind enough, successful enough, I could earn it. But now I saw it for what it was. What they really valued wasn't love. It was illusion. Legacy. Appearances. And I had shattered all of that in a single evening. Good. Let them choke on the silence I left behind, because I would no longer be the quiet daughter in the corner. From me. That moment on, I would speak loudly, just not to them. The days that followed were a blur of motion and desperation. We didn't sleep. We calculated, bargained, posted, called, prayed. Every time I looked at Lena, lying so still in that hospital bed with monitors quietly measuring what her body could no longer express, I reminded myself, we were not allowed to collapse. Not yet. Daniel sold his old pickup truck, the one I used to take weekend trips to the coast when we still thought time was something we could waste. I sold my work computer, my tablet, the sketch pads I'd carried with me since college. We took photos of our couch, our kitchenware, Lena's barely used bicycle, and listed them all online. Strangers came in and out of our home like visitors, at a museum of sacrifice, carrying away the pieces that once made up our little world. Moving somewhere? One woman asked, her hands resting on the back of our armchair. I just smiled. Something like that. Within 2 days, we raised just over $28,000. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a start. We were still more than $40,000 short. That number hung over me like a ceiling threatening to collapse. And yet, somehow, the help began to come, not from the people I had once considered family, but from those I never expected. Anna, a former roommate from my university days, saw my post online. We hadn't spoken in nearly 6 years. She sent $500 with a note. I know it's not much, but I remember how you once gave me a place to stay when I had no one. This is my way of returning that. Travis, an intern at my firm who had only been with us for a few months, walked into the office, now bare, and placed a small envelope on my desk. I was going to buy a new laptop, he said, but Lena needs this more than I do. Inside was $320, a neighbor I barely knew, who used to wave at us from across the fence while watering her plants, dropped off a casserole and a check for $200. A local cafe I had once helped redesign for free when they were struggling sent a Venmo transfer for $1,000 with a message. For the little girl who inspired the colors of our walls. Every day, a little more came in. Sometimes $5, sometimes $50, sometimes $100. Each one felt like a lifeline. Each one a small rebellion against the idea that only wealth or legacy could save a life. These weren't people who owed us anything. They weren't bound to us by blood. But they showed up anyway. And it was their kindness, not our bloodline, that pushed us closer to hope. Still, we weren't there yet. With only 48 hours left before Lena's scheduled surgery, we were $14,000 short. I began to look into high-interest emergency loans. I knew the risks. I didn't care. What mattered was time, and Lena didn't have much left. That evening, as Zion, I sat beside her, trying to hide the panic building behind my ribcage. Daniel's phone rang. It was his father. They were outside. Carol and Henry, Daniel's parents, had never been people of means. They lived in a modest home on the southern edge of the city, where they'd raised 2 children, grown vegetables in their backyard, and hung wind chimes on their porch. They weren't flashy. They didn't talk about investments or legacy. But they loved quietly, in a way that didn't need an audience. Henry asked me to come outside with him. In the cold parking lot, under a broken light, he looked me in the eye and said, "Tomorrow morning, you and Daniel are coming to our house. No questions." We arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. The moment I walked in, I knew something was different. The living room was almost bare. Their couch was gone. The framed photos that used to line the hallway had been taken down. Carol walked out with 2 mugs of tea and a manila envelope. She placed it in my hands. Inside were legal documents, a property, sale, their house, sold for $136,000. I stared at them. Why? Carol reached for my hand. Because she's our granddaughter. Because we'd rather sleep in a rented apartment than lose her. Because love doesn't count costs. I couldn't speak. The tears didn't come with noise this time. Just silence. Gratitude wrapped so tightly around my chest it made it hard to breathe. 3 days later, Lena went into surgery. We had the full amount. Not from the ones who claimed to love us in name, but from the ones who proved it in action. And that changed everything. Lena's surgery lasted 6 hours. I didn't sit the whole time. I couldn't. I paced the hallways, like a shadow, clenching the beaded necklace she'd made for me 2 birthdays ago. Tiny plastic letters strung together with trembling hands that spelled best mom ever. Daniel was silent, staring at the same corner of the waiting room wall as if it held answers no one else could see. When the surgeon finally emerged, mask pulled down, fatigue in his eyes, but a quiet, relieved smile on his lips, I broke. My knees gave out. The room tilted. And for the first time in weeks, my tears weren't from fear. They were from overwhelming, breathless relief. "She's strong," he said. "The surgery was successful. She'll recover." That night, I sat by Lena's bedside, watching her sleep under the soft hum of machines that now promised life instead of warning death. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt stripped down to nothing, and yet deeply whole. We had come so close to losing everything. And we survived. Because of people who didn't share our last name. Because of love that didn't ask for proof. When Lena was released, she was thinner, quieter, but still her. Still the girl who asked for pancakes at strange hours and kept a sketchbook of invented creatures. Daniel returned to work part-time, but I couldn't go back to who I was before. Something in me had shifted permanently. The woman who had once begged outside her parents' mansion didn't exist anymore. I woke up one morning and opened my studio again, just a dusty, unlit office with half the furniture gone. I stood in that space, breathing it in like the first inhale after a long dive underwater. Then I started over. I rewrote everything. From scratch, business plans, pricing models, client contracts, marketing. I spent long nights learning what I'd once ignored: licensing, legal structures, real estate partnerships. I reached out to past clients and asked for referrals, not favors. By day, I met with contractors. By night, I drafted proposals. On weekends, I attended real estate investment meetings where I was often the only woman in the room. I didn't care. I wasn't there to be liked. I was there to build. 6 months later, I landed a project designing interiors for a boutique hotel in Spokane. It was the largest contract I had ever signed, 5 figures that just a year earlier would have felt like fantasy. But it didn't stop there. The hotel's parent company owned a string of small commercial properties across Washington, and within a year, I was designing lobbies, offices, wellness spaces. Word spread. My name, once overlooked, once invisible, started appearing in industry blogs and mid-tier design publications. Still, I didn't post about it. I didn't send links to my parents. I didn't mention it to Lucas. Not out of spite, but because I had nothing to prove anymore. Their silence no longer echoed. It faded, like background noise in a life that had become too full for resentment. And yet, there was one moment, one afternoon I'll never forget, when everything came full circle. I was walking through the newly completed interior of a luxury, co-working space my firm had designed. Natural wood, soft curves, filtered light. A journalist from a regional magazine was interviewing me for a profile. She asked what drove me. I looked at her and said simply, "I once begged for help to save my daughter's life and no one came, so I decided to become someone who never had to beg again." The article came out a month later. The headline read, "From Desperation to Design Leader, Nora Lane is building more than spaces. She's building justice." I didn't frame the article. I didn't celebrate with champagne. I went home, cooked dinner, and helped Lena with her science project. But deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning, not of revenge, of legacy, the kind that's built, not inherited, earned, not granted, shared, not hoarded, the kind no one can take away. I never set out to ruin anyone. That wasn't my goal. I didn't plan revenge, and I never spoke their names publicly. But the truth, once spoken out loud, has a strange way of traveling further than you expect, especially when it resonates with people who've also been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel small by the very ones who were supposed to protect them. After the article was published, a clip from my interview went viral on social media. It was the moment I said, "I once begged for help to save my daughter's life, and no one came." Someone paired it with a photo from Lucas's engagement party, my mother in a gold dress, smiling beside an ice sculpture, the caption reading, "Legacy over life." It wasn't mine. I didn't share it. But once it was out there, it spread, like wildfire. Within a week, people had connected the dots. The Lane family wasn't as private as they thought. My parents' company, Lane Interiors and Living, began receiving dozens, then hundreds of one-star reviews. Comments poured in, calling them heartless, soulless, image-obsessed frauds. Several of their biggest vendors pulled out. Their flagship showroom in Portland was forced to suspend operations. I didn't feel joy. I didn't celebrate. But I also didn't look away. Lucas, once the family crown jewel, began losing clients in his brokerage. He posted a statement online, a thin attempt to distance himself from the story. Family matters should remain private. The internet doesn't know the whole picture. But it was too late. Screenshots had already gone around. His laughter. At the party, his indifference when I asked for help. It was all public now, and people didn't forget. Olivia, his fiancée, quietly deleted all their engagement photos. Then she deleted him. A few weeks later, I heard from an old mutual friend that she had called off the wedding entirely. Apparently, when she found out about the hospital records, when she saw the truth for herself, she packed her things and left without a word. Lucas was shattered, but not because of the loss, because of the shame. He'd built his identity on a performance, and now the mask had been ripped away in front of an audience he couldn't control. Then came the letter. It arrived on thick ivory paper, addressed in my mother's handwriting, formal and shaky. Inside, 2 pages of carefully crafted sentences. "We've lost everything. Your father is selling the house. Lucas is unemployed. Our name is in ruins. I'm not writing to assign blame, only to ask if there's anything you can do to help us back on our feet. No apology. Just desperation in tailored words." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in the back of a drawer. I didn't burn it. I didn't tear it up. I simply set it aside. The following week, my company signed a contract with a new client, a wellness retreat chain expanding across the West Coast. The deal was worth more than my father's showroom had earned in its final quarter. One afternoon, as I stood in a newly designed space that smelled of cedar and light, I received a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. It was my father's voice. He said, "I know we weren't the parents you needed, but maybe we can fix this. We're family." Family. That word. So clean, so hollow when spoken by people who'd weaponized it for years, who had chosen chandeliers over Lena's breath. I didn't return the call, because real family doesn't come knocking only when their walls crumble. Real family sells their house so your child can live. Brings tea to hospital rooms, gives quietly, stays fiercely, and never asks for recognition. And in this new life I'd built, one stitched together by kindness and earned success, I finally understood. Justice doesn't always arrive with punishment. Sometimes justice is watching the people who once looked down on you realize they no longer get a seat at your table, not because you slammed the door in their face, but because you outgrew the house they built. It was winter when they returned. A bitter wind rolled off the sound, and the sky was the color of slate. My office, now housed on the top floor of a restored building in Pioneer Square, overlooked the city I had rebuilt my life in. That morning, a receptionist slipped a note onto my desk. "Your parents are here. They asked to speak with you personally." For a moment, I stared at the note. No part of me was surprised. I had been expecting this, because people like them never vanish quietly. They wait until the storm swallows them, and then come knocking when they think the rain has softened the past. I walked into the conference room and saw them sitting side by side. My father looked smaller than I remembered, his once impeccable suit now wrinkled, his eyes hollow. My mother still clung to poise, hair neatly pinned, lipstick flawless, but her hands trembled as she folded them over her lap. "Nora," my father said, standing halfway. "Thank you for seeing us." "I'm listening," I replied, cold but calm. He opened a worn leather briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with documents, deeds, debt notices, legal warnings. "The bank's seizing the house next month," he said. "We're selling the last of the showrooms to cover legal costs. We've lost everything." He cleared his throat, embarrassed by the simplicity of the truth. My mother chimed in, softer. "We need help, Nora, just to keep the house. We wouldn't ask if there were any other way." I sat down slowly, eyes unmoving from theirs. For a brief moment, a flicker of something old stirred in me. Familiarity, maybe. Not compassion. Just the memory of what it used to feel like before. I realized I was nothing more than a supporting character in the story of their carefully curated life. "How much?" I asked. $200,000 would keep the house from foreclosure, my father answered. I nodded. "I'll give it to you, but on my terms." They exchanged a glance. My mother hesitated. What terms? You'll come here. In this room. You'll accept the money publicly, in front of my team. No spin, no statement about reconciliation. You'll accept help as people, not parents. No illusion, just truth. My father blinked. That's humiliating. So was begging you to save my daughter's life while you toasted champagne. Silence thickened the air. This is the only offer, I said, standing. Take it or leave it. 3 days later, they returned. My team gathered quietly outside the conference room, pretending to work while the scene unfolded. I slid the envelope across the table. Proof of transfer, documents, everything clean, legal, and final. As my mother reached for it, I raised a hand. Before you take this, hear me clearly. After today, you're no longer part of my life. No visits, no letters, no contact. I'm helping you because I refuse to become like you. But this is the last time I will ever offer anything. Tears welled in her eyes. We made a mistake. We didn't understand. You understood, I interrupted. You just didn't care until it cost you your reputation, she cried. My father didn't speak. He just took the envelope and left the room with the quiet dignity of a man who finally saw what dignity costs when it's built on image alone. After the door shut behind them, I exhaled. My hands didn't tremble. My voice hadn't cracked. I felt still. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just certain. That night, Lena curled up next to me on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. She looked up and said, "You look different today, Mom." I smiled. That's because I finally let go of something I should have dropped a long time ago. She nodded, as if she understood more than any child her age should. And maybe she did. Because she had been there too. She had lived through the silence. But from that night on, we were finished with it. If you've made it this far, thank you. For not just listening to my story, but for letting it live with you for a moment. People often say that time heals everything, but time doesn't heal what we don't confront. What healed me wasn't the passing of years. It was clarity, boundaries, and the quiet courage to build a different kind of legacy. Family, in its truest form, is not about blood. It's about presence. It's about who shows up when no one else does. About those who love without conditions, without an audience, and without a script. To anyone watching who has been made to feel small, invisible, or replaceable by the very people who were meant to protect you, know this: you are not broken, you are not weak, and you are not alone. You don't have to keep setting yourself on fire to keep their legacy warm. You are allowed to rewrite the definition of family. I did. And it saved my life. More importantly, it saved my daughter's. Tell me this. If someone who once abandoned you came back asking for help, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments. I truly want to hear your story. If this video moved you, share it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us what strength really looks like.